This tutorial is going to be how we do more complex seams. So complex seams are what we call it when we have multiple seams that all need to come to particular points or something together. So this isn't a very aesthetically pleasing example. It's kind of just, the colors don't really work together, the shapes don't particularly look that good together, but hopefully it helps you understand how you can get your seams to line up accurately so that you can get things like this little moment here where we have multiple points all coming in together, nice and crisp and clean. So this one has multiple pieces to it and they are all numbered, and it is important to do this in the correct order. So we're going to start with number 1. You'll see it's got its own little pattern piece with number 1 written on it, and it's also got a notch in the pattern. This one's only got 1 notch, others might have 2 notches. So where we've got a notch, it will have assuming I've cut them correctly, it will be have a little slit cut into the fabric like this to show you where that notch lines up with another piece. So I'm going to take piece 1 and that's going to line up with piece 2. It's actually going to line up with the longer edge of piece 2, and the notches should line up together. So if you need to have a little play around with shaping and arranging all the different pattern pieces, try to make sure you keep their number with them though. So number 2, oh, I took the wrong bit. I need to take the purple bit, not the number bit. So I've got a piece of number 1 and a piece of number 2. Trying to awkwardly do this over the camera. Now, 1 is going to line up with 2 here, and then very soon 3 is going to come in to them here. Now you might look at 3 right now and go, well, that's huge, but once they actually get stitched together and the seam allowance that's been added, see 3 is actually very small, but when you put all the seam allowance around, it does make it quite big. So once all the seam allowance is taken out, they will line up. So I'm going to line these up, and their notches, you'll see their notches line up together. It helps me find that I'm in the correct place and lining them up correctly. So this is going to be a seam, which means I need to put right sides together. So if these are my 2 right sides of my fabric, I fold one over top of the other to have right sides together. Now on this particular side, there is not too much overlap. There's going to be a little bit of overlapping. You're going to see this a lot more in other places where you might have a point that sticks out longer on one bit of fabric than it does on the bit that it's joining to. Don't worry about that, because the bit that you're trying to get to line up is where the seam is going to be sewn. So along where the seam will be, they should meet if they've been cut correctly and have been pinned and placed correctly as well. So a couple of pins is a good idea here to get it sitting right to start with. Now when we're doing these more complex seams, it's really important to sew correct seam allowance. You don't have to pin at the correct seam allowance. The pins aren't actually necessarily where you're going to sew, but we need to use the guidelines on our the guidelines on the machine near the presser foot to make sure that we are keeping it in a really good alignment. So we'll take this over to the machine and we'll sew this one, and then we'll come back for piece number 3. So the guidelines I'm talking about are these grooves here. For this particular pattern, I've cut it with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I want to follow that 5/8. So 5/8 of an inch guideline. So I'm placing the edges of my fabric along that. And that will mean if my needle is positioned in the center, that'll mean that I am getting the correct seam allowance through the whole thing. And I want to be really consistent to keep it at that spot. Keeping my edges flush with each other. Oh, I've gone over. I wasn't looking properly. So I've got a little bit over already. We'll keep it going from here though. Now with every single one I do, I should iron it. I can actually do the first 2 steps before I iron them and then iron both of those at the same time, because I'm not sewing the next one into, the next one's not going to join onto this seam that I've just done at all. So I can put the next one in. We'll go and get that. Now, this is where things might look a bit weird. I've actually forgotten to cut a notch. There should be a notch in this one, but I know I'll be able to line it up center. So 3 is going to join onto 2 up at this smaller end of 2. So we're going to fold them over each other. Now, it might be that I've left a bit too much seam allowance on piece 3, but it is correct that I should see these little triangular ends poking out, because all of that is just seam allowance. Where I'm actually stitching along this line here, you will see it does actually meet there. So if I were to say line it up so that these pieces meet, and I don't really have much overlap there, where I sew with the seam allowance, my seam allowance is down there. When I open that up, my 2 sides don't meet with each other. I'll have this big gap. But if I place them here, and my seam allowance comes from this spot, then they will be lined up evenly. So I'll get this one sewn and you'll see what I mean. So now, when they open up, these edges ignore that bit because that's seam allowance. These edges are pretty much on the same line. They're a little bit wonky, but they're pretty much on the same line. So now I do need to iron this before I move on and do anything else. It is a good idea to iron your seams open. Different projects will have different needs in terms of seams being opened or seams being closed. But most of the time, having open seams is good. So that seam gets open, that seam gets opened. Sometimes when you're quilting, you might actually want to use smaller seam allowances to start with. 1/4 inch seams can be quite popular, which is less than a centimetre. These are big 1.5 centimetre or close to 5/8 of an inch ones. Right. So we can see there, we've got nice crisp seams so far. All of these bits, they're going to get sewn into other seams later, so we don't need to worry too much about them. They're going to get taken away. So we'll go and attach our next piece. So piece number 4, I've had to recut these because I ran out, but I've grabbed a darker blue. So some of these will be darker blue than what you might see on the first sample. So piece number 4, it can really help to look at the first sample to work out the direction that that's going to go. So that's actually, sometimes you think, oh, it might be going like that against here, but actually it's coming this way onto there. So you will see that that notch will line up with this notch. And again, I want to have, where there's a bit of a triangular shape, that triangle should be poking out at the end there. Because where the seam allowance is, it will be sitting correctly. So I can pin this one, and I'm going to stitch over top of all of these other seam allowances that I've already sewn. So this is why I definitely had to, I'm just making sure they're flush together, sorry. This is why I definitely had to iron these 2 seams before I moved on, because if I go and sew them into another seam, sew these seams into another seam without ironing them, I can never fully get back into them and properly iron them open And this seam that I do won't be sitting as nicely because it hasn't been ironed open. Oh, I've just shuffled this the wrong way. A little bit of moving it around and fixing it. All right, I'll sew this seam and then I'll come back to the table to get number 5, and then after that one we will iron them again. So slight correction, I decided that I would iron my seam number 4 open before I sew on seam number 5. So that one is ironed open like that. That's because seam number 5 does kind of come into seam number 4 a little bit. They start to come towards a point together. So it was important that I have that seam open because I'm about to sew over top of it. All right, so I'm going to line up this seam now. And again, where I have the point of a triangle, that should be hanging over the end, like this. Sorry about the bad camera angle. So it should be coming out over the end, because when I fold it all back, I want this, oh, that's folding back too far for you. So I want this part here to be leaving enough seam allowance for when the big green triangle at the end comes over all of them, so that it can come in at this point here. So it's really important that I'm leaving enough up here. So I'm going to pin this one along here, sew that one, and then I will iron it again. Now here's how it's all looking. So I've got a nice big section here that is enough seam allowance for my green piece to come over it, and I'll just show you at the back how all of these seams, especially this last one that I just sewn, are really all coming on top of each other. So I have to be careful to really push down all the different seam allowances, because I don't want them to pull up and tuck into the seam when I'm sewing it, because they will get bulky. Right, my very last one is number 6. And this one is going to get joined to here, which means I fold right sides over top. And this one is where it all comes together, and there's a certain point that I need to get really accurately. There's the bell. All right, now I've probably cut some of these a bit bigger than they need to be. So if you're finding that they're not quite lining up correctly, it's all right if you have some bits that have a slightly bigger seam allowance, like it's probably going to be a bit bigger here. Now what is really important in this one, so I've got all my seam allowances folded down, ironed open. My most important part to get right here is right in here as I'm sewing this bit. I want to get my needle, if I can, to come right in to that point where these 3 fabrics all join. And that's what's going to let this point be really beautiful from the good side. So, and then I want to keep the lines nice and straight from there. So I'm going to pin that one really carefully and stitch it. So I'm not going to sort of travel up on this weird angle. I am going to make sure I go straight across here. If that means I need to cut off a little bit of fabric, I can do that. But I really want to get this point accurate. So I might show you when I've pinned and show you sewing this one. So as I've pinned this one, I've been really careful to get my pin right into that point. And this time I probably will use my pins a little bit to guide my seam, because as you can see, these ones aren't actually coming flush together. It just wasn't, I think I've cut these pieces a bit too big over the years as I've sort of used one piece to be the pattern piece for another one. I've gradually got a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger with some of these pieces, so they're not sitting quite right. Ideally, when you're quilting or sewing anything with this sort of patchworky style, you will make sure you're cutting all your pieces accurately first so that they should have the correct seam allowance. All right, so we'll probably be a little bit more guided by following my pins on this particular one, so I can get a nice straight line coming to this point down here. So from here, I'm really going to be lining myself up. This is going to need one more iron to get that last seam open, and then we'll have a look and see how I did. This has a huge seam allowance on one part. Could trim that away as long as I know that the rest of it is the right size that I need. Because if I'm making the overall box too small and that's needing to then attach to other boxes or other squares, I do need to make sure that they are the correct size. So maybe I did leave too much seam allowance in the green. You can see that my box shape's gone a little bit skewy. But I think my complex seam point hopefully will be really nice. Let's have a look. There it is. So because I made sure I got the needle right into that point and sewed across that part perfectly, I've got all of the points of these seams meeting really nicely. Now you could do it so that you have 6, 7, 8 points all coming to this one point. You need to be even more careful with how you line them all up, and that last seam is going to be the really crucial one. Whichever pieces you put together, if this was full of pieces that went this way, whichever ones we sew together last is the really crucial one to get those points all lining up. So there you go, that's our complex seam.